Good evening, everyone. I'm Perry Jones, and this is the first content episode of the Balanced Political Discourse YouTube channel. Normally, I would be taking my topic of choice from the comments on previous YouTube videos. However, as this is the first one, that's not really an option, so I have picked a topic that I think is a pretty decent baseline as far as knowledge is concerned. It's certainly something that a lot of people want to know, and it's something that I hear about on a regular basis when people are discussing potential political problems with the way our country's government is run. The problem is simply, why do we only have two political parties, namely the Republican and the Democratic parties? Now, there are many, many reasons for this. First and foremost is the fact that the elections in our country are set up in such a way that it is a win-lose scenario, meaning simply this. When a district is electing a representative to the House of Representatives, each candidate runs for one seat. The person that wins gets the seat. The person that doesn't win gets nothing. This kind of setup makes it to where the two-party system is favored. In contrast, if you compare our system to a lot of systems, for instance, parliamentary systems in Europe, what they do is they instead have an election where the parties themselves are running for the popular vote. Simply put, if a particular party in, let's say, England receives 40% of the popular vote, they then get 40% of the seats in Parliament. So why this system is effective for their government is because you can have smaller parties that get, say, 3 to 5% of the popular vote, which really isn't much of anything in political terms. But because they got a percentage of the popular vote, they still get representation in their legislature. Because we don't have a system like that in effect, essentially what it does is it makes it to where other parties that would want to run are at a disadvantage simply because they are fighting against two parties that are already firmly entrenched, already have funding, already have voters to draw upon, historically speaking, and thus are at a huge advantage to any newcomers that might be trying to come onto the scene. Also, a part of our system that really favors the two-party system is the fact that, at least at the local level, for instance, if I were to try and run for a municipal or county posting, if I am trying to run as an independent, I would have to, by law, present a petition signed usually by at least 1,000 signatures, not including myself, stating that these people are supporting me in running for this office. It may not seem like a whole lot, but it's an additional hoop that someone has to run through, whereas the county or municipal government simply asks the Republican and Democratic Party representatives who they're nominating to run for that seat, and they are automatically put into the running. There's no petition, there's no hoops to jump through. The parties in the area are simply asked, who are you putting up? They give names, those names are added. It's that simple. Also, you have to look into account that whereas Americans in recent years have been really wary of campaign funding, it costs money to run a campaign. We have media that's run as a business in this country, which means that airtime on television costs money, airtime on radio costs money, and internet advertising costs money. These things all cost money, and this money has to come from somewhere. So if you are an independent, in most cases you either have to be independently wealthy and thus finance yourself, or you have to do all the footwork yourself and actually go door to door and talk to people, which, if you're in a small municipal area, is possible, but in larger areas, the amount of people that you could conceivably reach with your platform is drastically reduced. Whereas obviously the entrenched parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, already have money lined up for their candidates through connections that they've already had and established in the past, so that if you have the support of one of these two parties in your area, your funding is pretty much taken care of. Sure, you may still have to woo some big businesses in your area or some particular interest groups in order to kind of get an edge on your opponent, but for the most part, the biggest part of your worry is taken care of because you don't really have to worry too much about funding because you have the party taking care of you. So these are things on the local level that are really huge advantages for Democratic and Republican-sponsored candidates. Other things that we need to talk about when we talk about two-party system in this country is the fact that, believe it or not, most Americans, as far as political idealism is concerned, fall within one of the two-party platforms. When you compare us to other countries, for instance, a lot of European countries that have somewhat similar systems of government that we have, with a legislature and a separation of powers and all that jazz, they have political parties that do not exist in this country. For instance, there are not many people in this country that would self-identify as a communist, or as a socialist, or as fascist. And yet these political parties exist in many countries around the world. Extensive studies have been done by political scientists that show that most Americans really do not fall too far to the right or the left of the center on a broad political spectrum. Whereas in other countries, you have people on the extreme left in the means of communism, and you have people on the extreme right by means of fascism. So since we don't seem to have a huge range of political idealism in this country, most people in the United States, their political ideals fall fairly squarely within one of the two-party platforms. Of course, this changes each election year as the parties seek to reinvigorate voters and bring new voters on, add new platforms to their party. But by and large, the central beliefs as far as political runnings of this country of each party stays fairly constant. This cannot always be said with particular candidates that, of course, during election years will have to woo voters from undecided voters or independent voters that don't identify with either party, and thus they need to kind of either appear more moderate or more radical depending on what their research says they need to do in order to obtain more of the popular vote. So with that in mind, taking into account the things that we've already talked about, if we have two parties that effectively encompass the grand majority of the political ideals in this country, and we have a win-lose system where we run for individual seats or individual postings in our federal government and in our state and local legislatures, the problem then becomes that any outside parties that may not have as much popular support just don't have enough votes in order to win any meaningful representation in our government. So that is primarily why, in large part, we have large-scale parties, such as the Democratic and Republican Party, that realistically have no real contenders in our government. And sure, every election campaign, we usually have the odd third-party candidate. I'm sure we all remember Ralph Nader, for instance, during the 2000 election. But the amount of votes that they are able to obtain is just not substantial enough to grant them meaningful representation in our legislature. And thus we have a country whose entire political scheme is completely divided within two opposing parties. And because we only have two opposing parties, it means that the ability of our legislatures and our government to get things done depends in large part on the willingness of the other party to work with them and on voter dynamics and what politicians think will alienate their voter base. Because, of course, like it or not, if there is one thing in the world that no politician is going to do, it is committing political suicide. Which, if you're not familiar with the term, political suicide simply means making a vote or an action while in office that makes you unelectable. Politics pays well. It gives a lot of status. It gives a lot of connections. So who would want to lose that? You want to continue getting elected as long as humanly possible. So you're not going to do anything that your information would lead you to believe would get you unelected next campaign. And of course, we also have particular systems that are set up to where people are always worried about re-election. For instance, contrasting senators versus representatives from the House of Representatives. Senators, by and large, are less concerned over the majority of their tenure about elections, simply because they're elected to 6-year terms. What this effectively means is that they get elected, and then for roughly 4 years of their term, election isn't a huge concern for them. Then, of course, for the last 2 years of their term, they're incredibly worried about their next upcoming election and what they need to do in order to maintain their seat. Now, comparing that to representatives from the House of Representatives, they are elected to 2-year terms. What this effectively means is that from the instant they get into office, they need to start thinking about their next re-election bid, their campaign, lining up donors and financial backers, and actively campaigning for most of their time in office. This is somewhat problematic because it means that many of the representatives in the House of Representatives spend more time worrying about their next election than they necessarily would be about, say, representing the people that put them in office. It's not necessarily the representative's fault either, it's just the way that the system is set up. So that ends up being somewhat of a problem. Also, with a two-party system, the inevitable problem doesn't become that there isn't enough debate, because we have many moderates in either party, we have many radicals in either party that often have views and leanings that are on the fringe, for lack of a better word, of their party platform. And this is a good thing. It's always good to have many ideas in the mix. Of course, as we don't have a unilateral system that allows a single group of people or one person to make decisions and be unchallenged, the more ideas we introduce to the mix means that inevitably the more arguing we're going, debating we're going to have in our legislatures and in our government about what we should be doing about any particular issue, or even just simply views on how our government should be operating. This isn't a bad thing, it's just kind of the downside of democracy that things often take time simply because you have to convince enough people to agree with you in order to get stuff done. The problem where the two-party system comes into play in this dynamic is simply the fact that often we have hardliners in both parties that will block an initiative that was started by the other party simply because they're the other party. So oftentimes you will have, it's all over the news, where you hear Republicans are trying to do this and Democrats are blocking them, or Democrats are trying to do this and Republicans are blocking them. And it's kind of the same old story. It goes on and on throughout our history, where one party has a certain initiative they're pushing, and the other party will simply round up enough votes to stymie their efforts and keep them from doing what they want to do. And you kind of have to wait until on a lot of polarizing issues, until one party has enough of a majority that they can effectively ignore the other party and just unilaterally push through their initiatives. Of course, that's not exactly a very good thing either for government, because when one party gets powerful enough to completely ignore the other party, that means that we only have one set of political ideals that are governing our country at the time, which to me as a voter and as an American citizen doesn't really seem like what we want. So one of the other things that I'm privy to hear a lot of times is that why do we have certain representatives that occupy their seats for, in some cases, decades at a time? Are they really that popular in their districts that they are constantly getting reelected? And there is a concrete answer for that question, and it is the process that is known as gerrymandering. To give you a little background on this, as you may know, every 10 years in this country we conduct a census. Among all other kinds of information that it provides us, such as information on race, ethnicity, economic standing, and so on of our citizens in this country, the most important function of it is simply to tell us how many people we have living in this country, and specifically how many people we have living in each state. Now, why is this relevant? As you may be aware, the House of Representatives is based on the population of each state. Each state gets a certain amount of seats depending on how many people it has living in that state as of the last census. So every 10 years, each state has to go through a process called redistricting, where they redraw the political districts in that state based on how many representatives they are now able to elect. So for instance, if you take a state that previously had 10 seats in the House of Representatives and now went up to, say, 15, we would have to redistrict the state to fit in 5 new districts because we would have to fit 5 more representatives. And many people wonder, well, how is this done? Simply, in most instances, we have a few states that are now changing their processes, most notably California, as I'll get to in a minute, that have made sweeping changes to this process. Redistricting is done by the political party that has the majority in the state legislature. I'm sure some of you can already tell how this might be a problem. What this allows the majority party to do is essentially look at past voter data in areas of their state and decide, how do we redraw these districts to where our party is favored? Now, I went ahead and pulled up some images so that you can kind of concretely see how this is done. Now, this is an image from a Washington Post article on gerrymandering. As you can see, in this image, Gerrymandering Explained, you have 3 different ways to divide 50 people into 5 districts. Now, you see, in this state, for instance, you have, for sake of the argument, we're only going to go with 50 people simply because visually it makes it easier to display. You have 50 people, 60% that are the blue party, and 40% that are red. Now, if you wanted to do perfect representation, as you can see in the graph numbered 1, you would have 3 blue districts and 2 red districts, which means blue wins 3 seats, red wins 2. That would be accurate representation because, of course, out of those 5 seats, blue would win 3 of them, so they get 3 seats, and red gets 2. Number 2, you have compact but unfair. This is where, instead of drawing the lines vertically, we draw them horizontally. The problem this makes is that, yes, we are still dividing these districts into even sectors, but it's done so in a way that all of the districts are primarily blue party, which means that majority of the time, all of those districts are going to elect blue party members, which is going to give unequal representation in the state legislature. Now, if you go to the last one on the far right, number 3, which is neither compact nor fair, you have this kind of Tetris aligning where it's been drawn so that you have 2 blue districts and 3 red districts. So even though you have a scenario where 60% of the popular vote is blue, red is still winning more seats in the state legislature than blue is. So what are the practical applications of this? Well, as you can see in this image that I'm showing you now, this is the image of a political district in Illinois. This is kind of a dramatic example, but this is actually a congressional district that was made that includes Chicago and some of the outlying areas in Illinois. Now, you might ask, why is this drawn in such an absolutely illogical manner? Simple. The party that was in power at the time determined that drawing this district this way gave their party the best chances based on past voting records and voting data of winning this district. So these tiny little lines connecting these big areas is simply a way to take pockets of support for a particular party and linking them together, thus making a district that is predominantly, sometimes in many cases, overwhelmingly favorable for one particular party. Now, going back to the instance of California, California recently is noteworthy in this discussion because they have decided to establish an independent commission that handles redistricting. Essentially what this does is this makes it to where the majority party cannot simply say, we draw the map however we want to, and thus make it to where the other party has almost no chance in certain districts of getting elected. We'll have to, this is a recent development, so we'll kind of have to pay attention and see how this actually affects the process, particularly as 2020 comes up, which will be our next census. So we'll have to see how redistricting goes with that recent change. Another option that some people have talked about is taking the process of redistricting entirely out of human hands. Well, you may be saying, well, if we take it out of human hands, what's actually going to do it? Simple. In this day and age where we are able to have robotics and complicated computer algorithms, the Washington Post article that I just showed you the image from talks about how it is perfectly plausible for us to use computer programs to accurately and evenly divide up states based on population into the number of districts that we want. We can even make it to where we can input the voter data and have it evenly reflect representation. As is a computer program, obviously, we can put in whatever parameters we want in order to obtain a more fair and representative sampling of that state. Now, you may think, well, this is just on the state level. How does that really affect the federal level? We'll think about it this way. The more powerful a party is in its state, the more backing it's able to give to federal level candidates. Obviously, senatorial elections are going to be much easier. Representative elections are going to be much easier. And it even affects things such as the presidential race, where support in certain states, particularly certain states that have high electoral votes in the Electoral College, certain parties can have enough of an advantage to where those states are able to influence how the presidential election goes. Obviously, if you have a candidate that, say, has such large states population-wise, such as Pennsylvania, New York, California, states that are consistently contentious. And as we saw in the 2000 election, even a single state in a contentious presidential election can be enough to decide which candidate receives the presidential election. So the question we have to ask ourselves then is, how many of us know about this kind of stuff? How many of us are concerned about it? And if we're not concerned, why aren't we? Why are we not hearing in the media about gerrymandering? Why aren't we hearing in the media about why we have parts of the political machine that are made to give certain parties in certain years a huge advantage over their competitors? As a country, as a democratic country, where we are electing officials that are supposed to be representing the people that elected them, why are we not concerned that we can have state elections where the number of seats in legislatures are not representative of how people actually voted? As we saw in some of those scenarios, if the Democratic Party gets 60% of the popular vote, why shouldn't they be getting 60% of the seats in that legislature? It would seem like a no-brainer. But these are things that we're not discussing. These are things that, by and large, Americans are not discussing. They're not talking about. They're not aware of this in the majority of cases. And so that's kind of something that I want to leave you with to think about. Talk with your friends about it. And the next time someone starts talking about some of the issues that we face in this country regarding the two-party system, now you are informed, can research on your own based on some of the stuff that I've told, some of the talking points that I've talked about tonight. And you can make an informed opinion on your own about possibly some ways that we could fix this, about some ways that perhaps we could change the makeup of our political system to allow third parties, to allow new ideas to invigorate the system. Because, to reiterate, in a democracy, the more ideas you have, the better. And there's really not such a thing as too many ideas, too much brainstorming in a government system. Obviously, the more people we have with different viewpoints, the more new, vibrant ideas we can bring to run our country. Also, I'm going to be leaving a link in the video description to a website called politicalcompass.org. What this website does is it's actually really cool. I used this in one of my political science classes. It has a test on it that you can take that will give you a series of questions. Please answer honestly. Obviously, you're going to get skewed results. But what this will do is it will give you a snapshot of where your political ideas and where your social and economic ideas place you in the political spectrum. What I really like about this is that they go beyond the whole right and left, because as they say on the website, and you can look all about their analysis after you take the test, or even before you take the test if you want to spoil yourself, what they did is they made a matrix that has two scales. They have an economic scale and a social scale. So there's a left and right economically, and then there's libertarian and authoritarian as the two polar opposites on the social scale. So instead of just looking at your political values in a vacuum and assigning you a random place left or right, they take how you feel about both social issues and economic issues, and then they place that on this square matrix, on this graph, showing you whether you're authoritarian right, authoritarian left, and libertarian right. And after taking this myself, I was actually quite surprised to find out that even though I consider myself, for the most part, Republican, I was really not very far from the middle of the graph, from, where the X and Y axes cross. And I'm sure that if any of you are to take this test, you'll find that you're really not far from the middle yourself, simply because our data as political scientists simply tells us that the majority of people in this country aren't far from that middle point. So with that, I challenge you to take that test, educate yourself, look into some of these issues on your own. I don't ever expect you guys to completely take my word for it on everything. Obviously, as a human being, I have some of my biases myself, as I addressed in the first episode. I will do my best, as always, to present factual-based discourse. But, once again, my point in this is not to tell you what you should believe. or tell you how you should believe or how you should think. My point in this is simply to bring up issues that, in some cases, aren't often discussed, so that you can think to yourself, I kind of want to look into this some more. And you can go and do some research on your own, and you can thus go into the next time you talk about politics with your friend a little bit more informed, and then more importantly, the next time you walk into a voting booth, you understand more about how our political system works and what you'd like to change about it. So with that, I bid you all good night, and please stay tuned for more videos. Please subscribe, like the videos, share them on Facebook, Twitter, whatever the new hotness is. I'm really not terribly on the up and up as far as social media comes around, but yeah, spread the word, and hopefully we can enter an era where more Americans are more concerned and more informed about the political processes that run this country. Good night, and have a good weekend.